You ever notice that the government will literally publish an official report calling it a retirement crisis? Those exact words in a federal document, and then 30 seconds later you'll see a financial services ad with a silver-haired couple laughing on a sailboat with a golden retriever, not a care in the world, sipping something with a little umbrella in it. That gap right there, between what the data actually says and what the financial industry wants you to believe, that gap is what this video is about. Here's the headline. 73% of Americans are currently on track to retire broke. Not because they're lazy, not because they're dumb, but because they are following rules that were written for a world that no longer exists, using numbers that were never accurate to begin with, on a timeline that assumes everything goes perfectly, which, spoiler alert, it never does. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to tear apart 5 things. The rules are old. The numbers are wrong. The timeline is broken. The system is quietly working against you. And there is still a way out. But only if you stop listening to the sailboat people. Let's go. Let's start at the beginning. Where did the save 10% of your income and retire at 65 rule actually come from? The 1950s. I'm not being dramatic. That framework, 10% savings rate, retire at 65, collect Social Security, done, was built for a post-war economy where most private sector workers had pensions, where healthcare costs were a fraction of what they are today, and where, critically, the average person lived about 8 to 10 years after they retired. 8 to 10 years. That's it. You worked your whole life, you got your gold watch, you maybe took a trip somewhere warm, and then statistically, you were done. Retirement planning in 1955 was basically planning for a long vacation, not a second life. Now think about what retirement actually looks like today. If you retire at 65, you could very realistically live another 25 to 30 years. The math on that is brutal. We tripled the length of retirement, kept the same savings rate, and then acted surprised when the numbers don't work. That's like doubling a road trip but refusing to buy more gas because the old amount always got you there before. And here's the thing that really gets me. The pension system that made the old rules even remotely functional has basically collapsed. In 1980, 62% of private sector workers had a pension, a real one. The kind where your company promises to pay you a monthly income for the rest of your life, no matter how long you live. Today, that number is under 10%. The pension didn't slowly evolve into something better. It just quietly disappeared, and we handed everyone a 401k in a pamphlet and said, good luck. Now let's talk about Social Security for a second, because this is where people really get confused. Social Security was designed as a supplement. That's the actual word they used when they built the system, a supplement to other retirement income. It was never supposed to be your whole retirement, but the median monthly benefit right now is around $1,800. In most American cities, that doesn't even cover rent. One-bedroom apartments in mid-sized cities are routinely running $1,200 to $1,500 a month. So your Social Security check covers your rent, leaves you maybe $300 for food, utilities, transportation, healthcare, and everything else, and calls it retirement. The math just doesn't math. Here's the way I think about it. Following the 10% rule in 2025 is like using a map from 1955 to navigate a city that has been completely torn down and rebuilt twice since then. The streets don't match, the landmarks are gone, you're going to end up somewhere you never intended to be, staring at a building that shouldn't exist, wondering what went wrong. And I want to be clear, this isn't about blaming people who followed the rules. The rules came from trusted sources. Your parents followed them. Your HR department handed them to you on your first day. Financial advisors with framed credentials on their walls repeated them with complete confidence. The problem isn't that you listened. The problem is that nobody told you the rules had an expiration date. So what does this actually mean for you right now? If you're currently saving 10% of your income and calling it retirement planning, I need you to hear this clearly. You are not saving for retirement. You are saving for a long weekend. A nice one maybe, but a weekend. Because the math on 10%, even invested consistently over a full career, does not produce enough to fund a 30-year retirement in a world with real inflation, real healthcare costs, and no pension waiting at the finish line. The old rules aren't just outdated, They are actively pointing you in the wrong direction. And here's the thing, the rules being wrong is only the first problem. Because the number everyone quotes as the retirement target, that number is a mathematical lie too. And we're going to run the actual math right now? Okay, $1 million. You've heard that number your whole life. Save $1 million and you're set. It's on magazine covers. It's in every retirement calculator. It's basically the cultural finish line for retirement in America. Cross the $1 million mark and you've made it. So let's actually run the math on it, because the math is not what anyone wants to talk about. The most widely used framework for figuring out how much you can safely withdraw from retirement savings is called the 4% rule. The idea is simple. If you pull out 4% of your portfolio per year, historically your money should last about 30 years without running out. That's the rule. That's what the sailboat people built their whole pitch around. 4% of $1 million is $40,000 a year, before taxes. So you're comfortable, you made it. 7 figures in the account retirement gives you $40,000 a year to live on. In 2025, in an economy where median household spending for retirees runs somewhere between $55,000 and $60,000 a year, and that's not extravagant living, that's groceries, utilities, a car payment, maybe a dinner out twice a month. You're already underwater before you factor in healthcare, and nobody wants to factor in healthcare. Here's the number Fidelity put out. A 65-year-old couple retiring today should expect to spend around $315,000 on healthcare costs over the course of retirement. Not insurance premiums alone. Total out-of-pocket healthcare expenses. $315,000. That's nearly a third of your magic million gone before you book a single flight, replace a single appliance, or handle a single thing that goes wrong. And things always go wrong. But wait, it gets better. Because your $1 million isn't just going to sit there quietly being worth $1 million. Inflation is going to eat it alive. At a 3% annual inflation rate, which is actually pretty close to the historical average, $1 million today will have the purchasing power of roughly $500,000 in 20 years. Half. Your money didn't go anywhere. You didn't spend it irresponsibly. The world just got more expensive while your dollars stayed the same dollars. The math just doesn't math. So, what is the real number? Honestly, for median retirement, not lavish, not Spartan, just normal, you're looking at somewhere between $1.5 million and $2 million in liquid assets. That's what actually covers 30 years of real expenses, absorbs healthcare costs, and holds up against inflation without leaving you rationing groceries at 82. And here's the part that should make everyone put down whatever they're drinking. The median American household approaching retirement has saved about $87,000. Not $870,000, $87,000. The gap between where most people are and where they actually need to be isn't a gap. It's a canyon. It's so wide it has its own weather system. You'd need a telescope to see the other side. And before anyone in the comments says, "But what about home equity?" Yes, your house has value, but you also have to live somewhere. You can't eat your equity. Equity doesn't pay for your prescriptions. Equity is an asset with an asterisk. Here's the honest framing. $1 million isn't a retirement number. It's a participation trophy. It proves you showed up and tried, and that actually matters, but it does not solve the problem, the way everyone assumes it does. The math behind that number was never as clean as it was sold to you. So the rules are broken. The target number is broken. And the timeline you were handed to hit that number? That's broken too. And this next part is the one that really keeps people up at 3 in the morning. Here's the version of retirement planning everyone gets sold. You graduate at 22, you start working, you contribute consistently to your 401k for 43 years. Compounding does its thing in the background like a quiet little engine, and you coast into 65 with a pile of money and a solid plan. 43 years. That's the runway. That's the whole model. The problem is that runway has craters in it the size of small countries, and nobody in the financial advice business wants to talk about them because the craters are kind of embarrassing. Let's start with student loans. The average college graduate today is walking out the door carrying roughly $37,000 in student debt. Some of you are laughing at that number because yours is double. And the thing about that debt isn't just the payments, it's what it delays. It delays buying a home. It delays building any liquid assets. It delays the moment where you can actually start putting meaningful money into investments. For most millennials, student loans push the real start of wealth building back by nearly a decade. You're not starting at 22, you're starting at 31 or 32 if you're lucky, and you're starting from zero, or actually below zero, because you still have interest accruing while you're trying to just get to flat. That decade matters more than almost anything else in retirement math. Here's why. The compounding math that makes long-term investing so powerful is front-loaded. The money you invest in your 20s does most of the heavy lifting. A dollar invested at 22 has more than 40 years to compound before you. Touch it at 65. A dollar invested at 35 has 30 years. That doesn't sound like a huge difference until you actually run the numbers and realize you've given up roughly half the growth just by starting 13 years late. Telling someone drowning in student loans to start early and let compounding do the work is like telling someone to run faster when their shoelaces are tied together. Technically, good advice. Completely useless given the actual situation. And then there's housing. We've reached a point where home prices in most American metros have outpaced wage growth so dramatically that save what's left over after rent is a joke with no punchline. Millions of people aren't falling behind on retirement savings because they're spending irresponsibly. They're falling behind because after rent, utilities, groceries, transportation, and the baseline cost of existing, there is nothing left to save. Compounding only works if you have money to compound. You can't invest dollars you don't have. But here's the part that genuinely makes me angry. Let's say you make it through the student loans, you survive the rent years, you get to your 50s with some real momentum going, you're finally in your highest earning years, you're supposed to be turbocharging your contributions, making up lost ground. And then the layoff happens. Workers over 50 get laid off at higher rates than younger workers and rehired at lower salaries. It's documented. It's consistent. And it hits at the exact worst moment, right when you were supposed to be doing the final sprint. Instead of accelerating, you're starting over at a lower salary, maybe burning through liquid assets while you find something new, watching the timeline compress in real time. So the straight line from 22 to 65 that the whole retirement model is built on? It doesn't exist for most people. The actual path looks like a detour map drawn by someone who'd been awake for 40 hours, starts late, earns slowly, faces interruptions, loses years, to circumstances that had nothing to do with effort or discipline. The timeline was always a best-case assumption dressed up as a plan. All right, so the rules are outdated, the number is wrong, and the timeline is full of holes. Here's the part that actually makes me angry, because some of this isn't an accident. Let's talk about the 401k, because most people think of it as the retirement system. Like it was designed from the ground up to replace pensions and give working Americans a real shot at a dignified retirement. That's the story. Here's the reality. The 401k was created in 1978. It was a tax provision buried inside the Revenue Act, and it was originally designed so that corporate executives could defer their bonuses and avoid paying taxes on them in high-earning years. That's it. That was the whole point. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It was a tax shelter for people who already had plenty of money. It became the primary retirement vehicle for the American working class almost entirely by accident. Companies figured out they could freeze pensions, hand employees a 401k match instead, and save themselves a fortune in long-term obligations. And just like that, the risk of running out of money in retirement shifted from the company to you, personally, with a pamphlet. Now let's talk about fees, because this is the one that makes people's eyes glaze over. And I get it. Expense ratios sounds like the most boring phrase in the English language. But stay with me, because this math is going to make you genuinely upset. Say you have a $400,000 portfolio. Your fund charges a 1% annual expense ratio. That sounds like nothing. 1%. You'd barely notice it. But over 30 years of compounding, that 1% fee versus a fund charging 0.05%, something like a basic index fund, costs you roughly $170,000 in lost growth. Not $170,000 you paid in fees directly. $170,000 your money never got to earn because it was being skimmed year after year before compounding could do its job. The financial services industry isn't stealing from you in a way that's obvious. They're just quietly taking a seat at your table every single year. And over 30 years, that seat eats more than most people have saved total. And the complexity isn't accidental either. The more confusing the products, the harder it is for you to comparison shop. Annuities with surrender charges, actively managed funds with opaque fee structures, insurance products bundled inside investment accounts. These things don't exist because they're better for you. They exist because they're more profitable for the people selling them. The confusion is the product. Then there's Social Security. The trust fund that backs Social Security benefits is currently projected to be depleted by 2033. That's not a fringe prediction. That's what the Social Security Administration's own trustees report says. If Congress does nothing before then, benefits would need to be cut by roughly 23%. And look, maybe Congress acts in time, but Congress's track record on acting proactively on anything is, let's say, not exactly inspiring. And finally, your traditional 401k. Every dollar you put in gets a tax break now, which feels great. But you're deferring taxes to the future. You're not eliminating the tax bill. You're mailing it to your future self at a tax rate nobody can predict. If rates go up, and there are legitimate reasons to think they might, given the national debt situation, you could end up paying more in taxes on that money than you saved putting it in. The retirement system in America is basically a group project where you do all the work, the financial industry takes a cut of your grade, and the government might change the rubric right before you turn it in. Understanding the fee structure of your accounts isn't optional nerd stuff. It's the difference between retiring and not retiring. Full stop. All right, I promised you a way out. And there is one. But it requires doing the math honestly instead of optimistically. The first concept you need to understand is escape velocity. There is a specific point in your investment journey where your annual returns start exceeding your annual contributions, where the portfolio is growing faster than you can feed it. That's the inflection point, where the math finally starts working for you instead of against you. Everything before that point is you pushing the boulder uphill. Everything after it is the boulder starting to roll on its own. To get there, The savings rate that actually works in today's environment is closer to 20 to 25% of gross income. Not 10%. I know, it's brutal. But the math doesn't care about your feelings, and neither does inflation. The Roth versus traditional decision matters more than most people realize. If you're in a lower tax bracket right now, Roth wins almost every time. You're paying taxes on the seed instead of the harvest. And if tax rates go up in the future, which is a reasonable bet given the national debt, you've already settled that bill. Low-cost index funds aren't exciting. They don't make for good cocktail party conversation, but they outperform roughly 90% of actively managed funds over a 20-year period. The boring choice is almost always the right choice. Here's your concrete action right now. Take your actual annual spending, not what you think you spend, what you actually spend, and multiply it by 25. That's your real target number, your liquid asset goal, not what some ad told you, your number. Then figure out your gap and work backwards from there. The path forward isn't complicated, it's just uncomfortable. Which is exactly why the financial industry keeps selling you complexity instead of math. The retirement crisis isn't coming. It's already here. It's just unevenly distributed, and the people who get out of it are the ones who stopped trusting the old map and started running their own numbers. Calculate your real number today. Annual spending times 25. That's where you start. If this video helped, subscribe. And check out my next breakdown on why your 401k fees are probably eating your future alive.